the hell is going on?
What's really going on?
We said, what the hell happened? You don't have to know what the hell is on it.
They see what's going on.
I don't know what's going on. What is going on? We must find out what is going on.
Hi, I'm Danielle Pudka.
And I'm Marc Thiessen.
Welcome to our podcast, What the Hell is Going On? And today we're asking, what the hell is going on with...
Quid pro quos. A lot of talk about quid pro quos in the news today. For those of us who are not Latin scholars, quid pro quo means this for that.
Yes.
And there's a lot of this for that going on or being discussed in the news today. Everybody's going crazy about quid pro quos. They're saying, there was no quid pro quo. There was a quid pro quo. We're going to impeach the president over the quid pro quos. And, you know, I just thought we would be interested to ask the question: what the hell is wrong with quid pro quos?
Yeah. No, I mean, look, I think the bottom line is there's nothing wrong with quid pro quos. We engage in all of them every single day. You have 4 kids. I have 4 kids. Our life consists of saying you can have this for that. I know. One of my kids is really angry that she's not going to get her driver's permit unless she gets all A's. So yes, that's a quid pro quo. Everything depends on what is the quid and what is the quo. That's
exactly right. So with this is all sparked by this whole, to some extent, by this whole Mick Mulvaney press conference the other day, where he came out and said that, look, there were 3 reasons why we were holding up the aid. One was because we were concerned about corruption, legitimate concern in a country like Ukraine. The second was Trump really wanted to know whether the Europeans were contributing to Ukraine's defense. And he said he investigated that, and they actually found out that less than 1% of the aid from Europe was lethal aid. So the Europeans are actually not giving lethal aid. We're the only ones giving lethal aid to Ukraine. And then he threw in, and we wanted them to cooperate in the Justice Department investigation into the 2016 election. And everybody set their hair on fire. That he had admitted to a quid pro quo. And so then he had to walk it back. And so he said, I never used the phrase quid pro quo. And people said, well, you didn't say the words, but you sort of said that. And it's a whole brouhaha.
It is a whole brouhaha, but of course the brouhaha didn't start with Mick Mulvaney. The brouhaha started with the president's phone call with President Zelensky of Ukraine and the whistleblower that brought it to the attention of the intelligence community inspector general, because that whistleblower, we don't know whether it's a him or her. We just know that it's a Democrat, I guess, because that much has come out.
Yes.
And of course we've read what the president says is the full transcript of this conversation that he had, and I got to say, if I read it, I mean, apart from the fact that I question whether Trump actually went to high school, I also wonder that it looked to me like that was what he was saying, was what they needed to do 2 things. They needed to investigate Hunter Biden, and they needed to investigate this whole CrowdStrike conspiracy.
But here's the thing. It's more than the CrowdStrike. But there is an official investigation by the Justice Department, led by John Durham, who's a career prosecutor, into how we got here when it came to the Mueller probe. We spent 2 years, tens of millions of dollars investigating the president's collusion with Russia. It turned out it never happened, wasn't true, and Americans rightly want to know the answer to that. But on this quid pro quo on Ukraine, number one, he didn't mention aid in the call. And number 2, our friend, Ambassador Volker, testified, it's leaked during the impeachment inquiry, that the Ukrainians didn't know the aid was being held up. So there couldn't have been a quid pro quo for the aid, because the basic standard operating procedure, if you're going to leverage your aid to get something, you got to tell the people who you're leveraging that they're being leveraged.
So not only is Trump incompetent at so many things, he's also an incompetent blackmailer?
That is one way of looking at it.
Yeah.
The other way of looking at it is that he didn't look. I think all of us agree that if people are trying to conflate 2 different things. One is the Giuliani going into Ukraine and trying to get them to investigate Hunter Biden, and possibly if there was any connection of U.S. aid to that, that would be a real problem. There is nothing wrong with the President of the United States, as Mulvaney pointed out, the Chief Law Enforcement Officer of the United States, saying that if you do not cooperate with the Justice Department investigation, then we may not be able to give you the aid. There's nothing wrong with that.
Didn't the president mention Biden in the call?
Yes, he did. He shouldn't have done that. We agree with that.
But
the Ukrainians didn't know that the aid was being held up. In fact, Volker testified they didn't know for a month after the Zelensky phone call that there was a hold on the aid. They learned about it from Politico.
Okay, so we're talking now about 2 different things as well, you and I. But the first thing I want to ask you, do you honestly believe that Trump was trying to get them to cooperate with the Durham investigation? Or do you think that Trump was trying to get them to dig up dirt on Hunter Biden?
First of all, let's let the investigation happen and find out what
Sure.
the facts are. But I don't think there's any evidence that he was actually conditioning the aid on either one of those things because the Ukrainians didn't know the aid was held up.
Although the aid was held up.
It was held up.
At his instruction.
It held up along with $4 to $8 billion of other aid that was held up at the same time. They put a hold on security assistance, environmental assistance, international organizations, and this was held up at the same time amongst all of that.
In the same context?
And it was held up because I think it's very legitimate to say that the President of the United States is concerned about burden sharing. I think that's a demonstrated fact.
But we know what the President of the United States was concerned about.
Right.
He was concerned about Hunter Biden and CrowdStrike. That's what he said in the call.
No. You
did.
go
I
back
agree
and look
with
at that phone call. The stuff about CrowdStrike and Hunter Biden came at the very end of the call.
Right.
The first thing he raised with the Ukrainian
burden
president
sharing.
is the burden sharing. The European Union is not doing enough. The Ukrainian president said, I agree with you not 100%, 1,000%. Yeah. And I've talked to Macron and I've talked to Merkel about this, and it's a problem. And Mulvaney said the other day that when they looked into it, the Europeans are not providing lethal aid at all.
Right.
We're doing all the lethal aid,
1%,
which is a
you
good
said.
thing,
Right.
something Trump did that Obama didn't do.
Right. So stop a second. So I think where we need to divide this up is that you and I kind of both focused, and a lot of people have focused on this Mulvaney press conference now. And I think you and I both agree that if that was the quid for the quo, in other words, if the three things that he talked about were the quid for the quo, that's cool.
Yes.
Right?
Agreed.
Okay.
Agreed
So
100%.
Mulvaney, quid pro quo, cool.
Yes.
Okay. And when people
And
say...
the quid pro quo didn't happen.
Right.
Because the timing just doesn't work. So what he said was incorrect. He was wrong when he said that that was a factor in the decision making, or at least it wasn't a factor that was expressed to the Ukrainians. And again, if you're doing a quid pro quo, they got to know what the quid is that they need to deliver in order to get the quo.
Got it.
Right?
Fair enough.
But
All
if
right.
those three things were actually what they were, he actually said it had nothing to do with Biden. It had to do with the investigation into 2016,
Right. And of
which
course-
turns out was not correct.
Right.
But if it had been correct, it would be fine.
Right. If it had been correct, it would be fine. Of course, as it was a lie because that's not what the president said because we have the transcript.
But we're
So
going
agree.
down a rabbit hole here because what I want, the reason
What you
we're
want to
doing-
do is defend the president, and the
No,
president's words
no,
won't let
that's
you.
Not what I want to do, Danny. What I wanted to do with this podcast is to talk about quid pro quos.
Yeah, no, so-
because
and we do-
everybody's
we are.
running around
Right.
saying you can't have quid
No,
pro quos.
and that's one of the reasons why we invited the guest we did, just to sort of lead into this for a second, because I do think that this whole Mulvaney thing, as with everything in the Trump administration, the president likes to you give him an inch and he takes a mile, and everybody hates that about it, but his opponents do exactly the same thing, which is this insistence that somehow we are not allowed to ask for things in exchange for our assistance, which is absurd, unconscionable. And by the way, the American public should be outraged if we're not engaging in quid pro quos.
Exactly. Arguably, with the exception of things like disaster assistance and things when there's a humanitarian catastrophe, and Americans are the most generous people in the world and they're happy to give that assistance. When we're talking about development assistance, political assistance, military assistance, you're damn right we want something in exchange for it. And it can be good things.
Right.
It can be democratic reform, cracking down on corruption. Joe Biden...
Paying
by
American
the way,
companies.
Joe Biden...
Another reason we've held up aid in the past.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
But not stealing intellectual property.
Right.
But, Joe Biden... When he ran around saying there was no quid pro quo. Well, actually, there was. Joe Biden threatened to hold up $1 billion in loan guarantees if they didn't fire a prosecutor who he said was corrupt. Put aside the Hunter Biden stuff for a moment.
No, I agree.
That's a quid pro quo.
Right.
It's maybe a good quid pro quo
Yeah.
in his telling, but it's a quid pro quo. So let's get past this whole myth that quid pro quos are a bad thing. Everyone's learned one Latin phrase in Washington and is using it without understanding what the hell it means.
So to talk about all of this, we've got the perfect person. A really good friend of both mine and Marc, Lester Munson, is now a principal in the international wing at the BGR group, but he was the staff director of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee when Bob Corker was chairman.
Which is the committee that oversees all U.S. foreign aid.
Exactly. He's actually on the executive committee on something called Modernizing Foreign Assistance Network, which is a really good thing. He worked for Congressman Mark Kirk and then Senator Mark Kirk, who's a friend to both of us. And prior to that, he worked for USAID. So he knows his quid pro quos.
And you better tell us about him right now.
So, Les Munson, thank you so much for joining us here today. It's a really great opportunity for Marc and me to talk about this great question of foreign assistance, quids,
Pro quos.
and quos. Exactly. So I know Marc is really eager to start this out. So, Marc, ask your big question. What the hell is going on with
Quid pro quos. So, I mean, everybody's running around saying, oh my gosh, hair on fire, quid pro quos. We can't have a quid pro quo. There was no quid pro quo. But we do quid pro quos every day when it comes to foreign aid, don't we?
We do. It's either conditional or we're trying to change someone's behavior around the world. We're trying to get them to have better health policy. We're trying to get them to take care of their weapons better so they don't fall into the hands of the wrong guys. We attach conditions to all of the foreign aid, almost all of the foreign aid that we give out, except maybe some little, humanitarian grants here and there where we just kind of give it to a do-gooder group and say, go do something good with this $1 million.
Let's zoom out for a second to 30,000 feet. It's really remarkable. Almost consistently over the years, the American public believes that we give some vast amount of foreign assistance in the world. Do you know how much our foreign aid budget is, ballpark?
Sure. If you include the whole operations of the State Department and all the foreign aid that we do, it's about $60 billion a year. That's somewhere around less than 1% of the total federal budget.
Does that include security assistance through the Pentagon, or is that a separate account?
That includes security assistance through the Pentagon.
Okay. So it's not a lot of money, but Americans want bang for their buck, right? And so there's an idea out there that foreign aid, to the extent that people oppose foreign aid, it's like, oh, it's just charity. And we don't want to do nation building. We're sick of doing nation building and helping other people build their societies. We want to do, as Barack Obama and Donald Trump both said, we need to do nation building here at home. We need to cut this foreign assistance. But to the extent that Americans support foreign aid, it's because we're getting something for it. It's because it's improving our security. It's making us safer. It's giving us more allies. It's giving us more capable partners who can take the burden off of us and our military around the world. Isn't that why we do foreign aid?
That's the whole idea. It'd be much better to spend $1 billion on foreign aid in the Middle East than to send more American, with their boots on into harm's way. We'd much rather spend the money on foreign assistance than on possibly shedding American blood to get something done abroad. So to that extent, it can provide valuable tools to policymakers who are trying to change things on the ground, who are trying to promote prosperity in certain countries, which promotes prosperity here, or to, prevent the next conflict.
And isn't it true also that Congress very often adds quid pro quos to the foreign assistance program? Because we all worked in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which oversees foreign assistance. There'll be times where the administration wants to reprogram money to spend from one kind of program to another, and we come to them and say, well, hold on, we're putting a hold on that until government X does what we want them to do.
One of the great examples right now is U.S. assistance to Central America, which President Trump put on hold, and Congress immediately freaked out, saying, don't do that. It's really important we keep all these programs going. But if you look at the appropriations bill that actually provided the president with the money to give assistance to Central America, there are 15 different reasons why you might suspend the aid there. So Congress itself is imposing quid pro quos on the money, just across the board on almost every program we have.
So again, from this big, broad perspective, $60 billion, that includes security assistance. It also includes the big kahunas that we give money to here. So we've got Egypt, we've got Israel, two consistently huge chunks. The Israel money is unconditional. The money to Egypt is very conditional. And folks, I really want to underscore this as Marc and I talked to Les. When you say conditional, what you're saying is you, foreign country, must do something in exchange for getting it. That's what conditionality is. And that's one of the reasons why Marc is harping on this expression, because, in fact, we are not going to Egypt, opening up a large helicopter and tossing out cash to people. We actually do have things that we want them to do that are things that make them a better ally and make us a better ally.
By the way, some of those things are not always popular with the home government. They
no
don't
kidding.
always want to do the things that we are essentially giving them assistance to do. And they, frankly, I think, not all of the time and not even most of the time, but occasionally would rather just walk away from the deal.
I mean, let's talk about some of the quid pro quos that we all support. For example, the aid to Egypt and Israel that you just described, that was a part of a quid pro quo for the Camp David Accords under President Carter, wasn't it? So President Carter had a quid pro quo. He said, okay, well, we're going to give you massive aid, but you in exchange for peace.
And there's
That
been
not a good thing?
relative peace between Egypt and Israel for over 40 years.
And
Yeah, it's been
and
pretty
that's
effective.
and that's worth. I mean, we have spent in the hundreds of billions of dollars on both those programs, and I would say that from the standpoint of most of the American people, that's been money well spent. And it's certainly much cheaper than having to have boots on the ground. The same goes, by the way, for Jordan. The same goes for a bunch of other countries where we're providing very substantial amounts of assistance. And often, as you say, it's because we want you to also fight bad guys.
We were there. One of the classic example of development assistance is South Korea. The U.S. spent billions of dollars building up the Korean economy after the Korean War, and now it's one of the biggest economies in the world and a very good trading partner for the United States. They provide very high-tech goods that we otherwise might not have. It's been a terrific win for U.S. foreign assistance.
And go back even further, just to the Marshall Plan, which was the mother of all foreign aid programs, right? It's seen in a lot of ways as a very generous gesture by the United States, but in fact, we reaped much more benefit from it than we ever gave away in aid in terms of having a Europe whole, free, and in peace, standing up to the Soviet Union.
Shoulder to shoulder with us through the Cold War. Yeah, exactly.
The irony here, and of course, people are going to think that we're setting up to excuse the president and his quid pro quos, which we're not. At least I'm not. But wouldn't you say that it is probably the most effective way for us to leverage assistance is actually to get countries to do stuff? In other words, to say, we're going to give this to you if you do that?
Sure. And I even think there's an unpopular example, relatively unpopular in our country, which is peacekeeping.
Yeah.
We spend a lot of money through the UN for peacekeeping forces around the world. I think there are about 15 different missions right now. And it does cost us a few $billion, I think $2 or $3 billion a year, but it means that we don't have to send U.S. troops into harm's way to keep the peace between two belligerents, whether it's one country against another country or
India,
one country against
Pakistan,
another.
Israel,
Exactly.
Lebanon.
So it's, relatively speaking, it's a very efficient use of resources, and there's no risk of our blood being shed.
It's also a way of transferring. Sorry, Mark, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but it's also a way for us to transmit our values. I mean, we give to Egypt a couple $100 million every year in what's called budgetary support. And yes, for normal people out there, what that means is cash. For years on end after Camp David, we gave that money away without actually getting anything in return. And about 20 years ago, we started demanding that they make economic reforms, privatization, that made their economy more efficient. Can you think of other examples like that?
So, great question. I think one of the things we've done that's really been probably the best advertisement for American values and the best promoter of American values has been PEPFAR, which stands for the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. It was started under the Bush administration in 2003, and it directly addressed a huge crisis in mostly Africa, where we're going to lose an entire generation of people, men and women, to HIV. The transmission of the virus had spread into heterosexual groups, and it was running rampant across the continent. President Bush announced this plan, which was supported by both houses in Congress, both Republicans and Democrats, called PEPFAR. It's spent about $5 billion a year. It's still going, and it has stopped this epidemic from wiping out probably 100 or more million Africans and other people who were vulnerable to this virus. And what better advertisement for American values of humanitarian concern and the value of the individual than for us to go into a place where we have no great strategic interests and spend a lot of money to keep people alive.
So one of the, going back to direct American interest for a moment, so one of the things that we've seen is that there's a link between poverty and terrorism. Not in the sense that poverty creates terrorism, because most of the terrorists, if you look at them, are actually very well off. But when you have impoverished societies and unjust societies, people are more likely to turn to hateful ideologies, right? And so our aid generally is not focused on just alleviating poverty. It's focused on getting governments to reform and alleviate poverty more directly.
That's right.
Right?
It's giving agency to the individual. Right? In a country where people are oppressed, where they have no voice in their own government, they're more likely to turn to one of these hateful ideologies to kind of carry out what they view as, their version of justice in the world. If we can help them move towards, and it doesn't have to look exactly like ours, but if we can help them move towards some sort of representational government where they have a voice in what their own lives are like, it's going to make a huge difference in the war on terror.
But we use the aid not so much to directly alleviate the poverty, but as leverage, quid pro quo, for reforms to economies, to government institutions that will help people lift themselves up out of poverty and have opportunity. And that is
That's
a
right.
national security interest
That's
of
right.
the United States
We've,
as well, right?
We've set up an entire foreign aid agency called the Millennium Challenge Corporation that's premised on developing countries reforming their own systems to win compacts, so-called compacts, with the United States, where we will help them meet some of their needs, some of their pragmatic needs that they have with their people. Set up an entire foreign aid agency. It spends less than $1 billion a year, but it's had a huge impact in 20 or 30 different countries around the world already.
And those countries have to meet certain requirements.
That's right.
Quid pro quos, you might say.
Democracy, human rights, smart
Transparency.
financial accountability. That's right. Transparency, things like
So,
that.
I mean, the biggest, and the reason that the MCC, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, was created was exactly to respond to this complaint on the part of a lot of members of Congress, which is that, in fact, aid isn't a charity operation. Of course, when there's an earthquake, when there's a tsunami, when, there's Ebola, the American people are, I think we can say this and be backed up fully by the statistics. The American people are among the most generous in the world in terms of just, here, let us help. On the other hand, this vast machinery of foreign assistance that we're really talking about, the biggest complaint about it is that it's not directly tied to performance, to change, to transformation.
And that it allows developing countries to become reliant on foreign assistance. They don't have to reform their own tax system or their own economies to be able to survive, for their regime, for their government to keep going. They don't really have to reform if we're going to keep sustaining them.
I want to ask one follow-up question before we segue into the politics of this, because the politics are really important. But I think that all of us have exactly the same experience on Capitol Hill, and I can't think of a Democrat who would disagree. We all have experience with the notion of assistance programs being used for what we would call political purposes. And I mean, I can think about this, for example, I brought up Egypt, but that's because Egypt is such an important recipient. I know that we have sat on assistance for the Egyptian government because they have not allowed opposition parties certain liberties, because they've forced NGOs to register, right? Those are considered by the foreign nation extraordinarily political conditions.
Well, and just in our own politics, when Democrats are running the show, you tend to see more programs related to family planning and climate change. And when Republicans are in control, you see more security assistance and other different kinds of things. So there's, each of our own parties has their own priorities in these programs also.
And then there's also an ideological divide in the sense that Democrats, not all, but many on the left, see foreign aid as charity, as generosity, and almost don't want to attach. So, the reality is that we want U.S. aid to be
Give us credit.
To give us credit because we want leverage, because we want something for it. It's not necessarily in a bad way, but we want people to do the right thing, or bad people to do things that we need them to do sometimes as well, right?
There are three great rationales for us spending this, $30 or $35 or $40 billion a year on foreign assistance. One is it's in our national security interest to do so, and it makes us safer. Another is it provides more economic opportunities for our people, so our economy grows, our way of life improves. And third, it's to advance our values or our humanitarian concerns. And if the foreign aid isn't meeting any one of those three criteria, we shouldn't be doing it.
Now, let's talk about the burning hot potato of the moment. I'm sure by the time this podcast is up, Donald Trump will have done something else outrageous that we will need to come back and talk about yet again. That all this being said, right, all the outrage surrounding quid pro quos as a generic matter is just so much BS. I think we can say that on our family broadcast. But asking a foreign leader to investigate your opponent or your possible opponent in the presidential election seems to be the not right kind of quid pro quo.
But that didn't happen.
How do you see it, Les?
Well,
Mark and I have time to beat
I'm
each
from
other up.
Chicago, and there are ways of doing
Say no
Mayor
more.
Daley at the Mayor Daley School. Right?
if a judge is having a conversation in his office with a lawyer, and that lawyer's trying to get a certain outcome from the case, the judge will say, you know what? I've got to go get a sandwich. I just want you to know there's an empty drawer in my desk here. I'll see you in about 10 minutes. And he would come back and the drawer would not be empty anymore when he got back. He didn't have to say, put $100,000 in there, but that's what happened.
So that's how you see what happened
Just
in that
saying, I'm from
conversation.
Chicago and that's how people did things.
But
Yes.
that doesn't happen for the most part, and I'm not sure that that's what happened in the case of Donald Trump. And we'll get to that in a
We'll
minute.
get to that.
But I mean, for example, one of the things that got in this whole conversation with Mick Mulvaney the other day, where he went out on the press conference and sort of suggested there was a quid pro quo, and then walked it back. But the quid pro quo, he very clearly said in that press conference, they said the holdup on the money had nothing to do with Biden, but it may have had something to do with the Durham investigation, which is a investigation being led by John Durham, a career prosecutor at the Justice Department. Would it be a legitimate use of foreign aid to use it, putting aside Trump in the specific situation, but as a general proposition, to use foreign assistance as leverage to get a country to cooperate with the Justice Department in a criminal probe?
It seems like it's less of a gray area, and that might be closer to something that's appropriate. It still, I think, kind of gives you pause because it's so closely tied to what happened in 2016 and what might happen in 2020.
But put it aside from that, I'm just looking at the general principle. So, I mean, a country we're trying to get them to extradite Julian Assange to us, or a terrorist, or something like that, or a criminal we're wanted like that, and we'll say, you know what? Senator Corker might call up that country, or Senator Helms might call up that ambassador and say, you know what, I think I'm going to put a hold on your aid until that extradition comes through. Completely valid use of the power of foreign aid, isn't it?
Sure, but I think it would also be closely tied to the legitimacy of that extradition request. Sure. If it were locked down and you had gone through a very good process through our legal system and everyone felt that this was the right thing for us to be doing, I don't think anyone would have a problem with that kind of conditionality. If it were a little more suspect and it seemed like it was a little not as close to the facts or was taking a certain viewpoint, then people would be much more skeptical of that kind of exchange.
So here's another question just about process, because we're all used to talking about the Hill, having come from the Hill. We're all used to members of Congress having particular positions. And, for folks who don't know out there, the process is that when assistance is obligated, there's above a certain pretty low level, a notification is sent to Congress that members of Congress use a privilege, and it is a privilege, not a right, called a hold, to not allow those assistance monies to go forward. And we've seen tons of that. Left, right, center, everybody, for all sorts of reasons, both sublime and ridiculous. I'm sort of scratching my brain and thinking to myself, when was the last time I heard the President of the United States stomping on someone's assistance program? Have you seen that less ever?
Do you mean stomping on an assistance program for a specific country?
Yeah.
Well, I think that the president just ended a whole chunk of aid to Central America, as we discussed earlier. I mean, he unilaterally stopped the money from being spent and took it on himself and said, I'm making this decision. He could have easily have said, hey, Congress, I'm required to do this by Congress because they place all these restrictions on it. Instead, he said, I want to end this aid because I'm very concerned about what's going on in Central America and the impact it's having on our border, right? He wanted to be the agent of change. So he went in and said, I'm not going to do this assistance program anymore, and we're going to take a hard look at it.
Well, but also, in this context of the Trump hold on the aid to Ukraine, it was, everyone's focused on that because of the possible connection to Biden. But the reality is that in August, he held up $2 to $4 billion of aid in 10 categories. All development assistance, global health contributions, international organization funding, international narcotics control, and peacekeeping activities. OMB put a hold on everything. $2 to $4 billion to conduct a review.
Because they might do a rescission. It was held in anticipation of there being a possible rescission. That's right, all of August. And there was a beautiful timeline on that because they announced the rescission within this 60-day window where the fiscal year was going to end within the 60 days, which meant the money was going to expire. Everyone on the Hill freaked out. Oh, it's not really rescission. They're playing games with us here. This money will expire before they can even do the rescission. It was a whole little mini drama here inside the Beltway.
And that was a Mick Mulvaney drama, as best I understood.
And it was parallel to what was going on with the Ukraine money. It happened at about the same time.
But the idea that we should not be giving money to countries that hate us should not be terribly controversial, should it?
No, I think everyone largely agrees with that, but it does get to the question of, well, are we actually giving money to governments of countries that hate us? And if you look closely at the details, that happens rarely.
Very rarely. I mean, when we give money to Afghanistan, we're not giving money to the Afghan government. When we give money to Pakistan, that I still have questions about, by the way. But we're not.
Example.
But in fact, there are tons and tons of provisions.
Hates us, but is actually helping Al Qaeda and the Taliban.
Right. No. I mean, that's exactly right. But I think that Les is correct. There are very few instances you can find where money is being given to a government. We are giving money through NGOs. We're giving money to specific projects. And I would add on the Central America stuff, those countries may or may not hate us, but we have a very strong interest in countries like Honduras and Guatemala having, for example, aid programs on rule of law, better policing, better justice systems. Why? Because then people will stop leaving and coming to our borders. This is what Donald Trump seems to not understand.
But then I agree with you, it was poorly executed, but there's nothing wrong with him doing what he did, which is to say, if you don't make certain changes, then we will cut off the aid. That would have been smarter rather than just cutting it off, because then you give them an incentive to show that they're going to deliver the quo in exchange for the quid.
Yeah, this is a continual battle, because let's face it, at the end of the day, even with this money and with all of our resources, we can't affect other countries' behavior that much. We can do a little bit around the margins that kind of help the position of our country or maybe some humanitarian concerns. But at the end of the day, we're not going to, through some assistance program, turn the Honduran government or the Nicaraguan government from a corrupt or incompetent government into something that's a bright, shining light on the hill. We're just not going to be able to do that. So we have to kind of understand what the purpose of the program is. What are we trying to get out of it? And if it's not working, let's stop doing it.
It looks like, to some extent, there's carrots and sticks in foreign policy, right? The carrots are our aid, and we can use that as a tool to advance our interests. And the sticks are our military. Donald Trump has added to that toolbox the threat of tariffs. And that combination of carrots and sticks. I mean, with Mexico is actually is enforcing its immigration laws since the tariff threat. So that combination of carrots and sticks actually worked, at least when it comes to Mexico.
He's added the tariffs are really a new tool in the toolbox, and I think you have to give him some credit for realizing that was an opportunity for us.
Yes, realizing it and then really going to town with it and destabilizing the global economy and putting us at risk of recession.
Canada was misbehaving. Come on now.
Yeah, I know. I got to say, I'm totally with him on Canada.
Yeah. Blame Canada. South Park reference, sorry.
Listen, I mean, look, we need to wrap this up, but I think that it's a very movable standard. And if people think, and I've heard a lot of very empty professions by people who don't know what
the hell they're talking about.
Who don't know what the hell they're talking about, that quid pro quos are absolutely unconscionable in foreign aid. To the contrary, I think they are a constant, and by the way, they are exactly what the American people should demand in their foreign assistance. As you say, Les, there needs to be a little clarity about what the
exactly
quo
what
is.
it is we're trying to get out of this. That's right.
So basically, to sum up our conversation, I think we all agree quid pro quos are good. It just depends on what the quo is.
Yes. I think that sums it up.
How do you say amen in Latin? Amen.
Amen. Very good.
Thanks for joining us.
Les.
You bet. Thank you.
All right, so I think we came to some agreement here, which is that not only are quid pro quos good when they're the right quos, but the American people damn well expect us to have quid pro quos when we give away their hard-earned tax dollars to foreign governments, instead of, as our old boss Jesse Helms used to say, pouring them down foreign rat holes.
Yes, he did say that. He did say that, and in some cases he was totally right, of course.
Absolutely.
If I think about the amount of money we've spent in certain places and what we've gotten for it and what the people on the ground have gotten for it, it is highly regrettable. We definitely want an effective foreign assistance structure. Again, you and I disagree about the president's own assessment of this. But again, we come back to one particular theme often when we're talking. If Congress doesn't like what the president's doing, why doesn't Congress do more? I have failed to understand completely why, for example, Congress abolished earmarks. It's like, earmarks are terrible things. I'm sorry. So what you Congress, I don't care, Democrat, Republican, what you Congress want to do is you want to write a big, giant check for, $60 billion in foreign aid. And then you want the executive branch, for the most part, a large group of unelected officials, to decide exactly how you're handing it out? I mean, this is how...
You're in favor of spending money on, putting shrimp on treadmills?
Is
that what you're in favor of? You're arguing for boondoggles, Danny.
I don't know why it is that you think that some AID official is a better judge of how to spend money in Egypt than a member of Congress.
There's two different things. One is there's earmarks when it comes to domestic spending, and there's
that's your shrimp treadmill. Is that a thing, by the way?
That actually is a thing. Senator Coburn actually puts out used to put out a black book every year of the worst earmarks. So, I think earmarks are a problem, but that's a topic for another day. In terms of foreign policy, I agree with you 100% that Congress has the absolute right to condition U.S. aid.
But when Congress abdicates, but what they do is they hand power over to Donald Trump to stomp on assistance programs. That's the honest to goodness truth. Because if Congress says this shall be spent, then the president can't turn around and say, no, it shan't.
No, I agree. I think Congress should be, but I think Congress should be doing more quid pro quos. I think Congress should be insisting that our aid be spent on things that are advancing American interests. We should be using our aid to promote economic reform so we have better trading partners. We should be promoting democratic reform so that countries are not as much of a threat to us because democracies are not a threat to us. We should be demanding access for our military to bases and to strategic waterways with our foreign aid. We should be demanding that other countries step up and fight the bad guys for us so that we don't have to send our troops all over the world. This is what quid pro quos are all about.
Right.
And we need more of them, not less.
They're a good thing. And we also agree that notwithstanding incompetent blackmail efforts, that the president probably shouldn't try and condition anything on getting dirt about Hunter Biden or about the conspiracy CrowdStrike. Right? We agree about that,
We
too.
do agree about that, absolutely.
Right, let's end on that high note. And our team here at AEI is Alexa Santry, Matt Weinset, Jen Moretta, and Macy Heath.
Let us know what topics you'd like us to cover. You can get in touch with the show by emailing us at whatthehell@aei.org.
Or you can reach us on Twitter. I'm at @dpletka.
And I'm at Marc Thiessen. That's Mark with a C.
Please rate and review the podcast. If you like the show, please subscribe, share it, comment on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening to this.
Thanks for listening.